You notice the waves is a dark and light. From a three-dimensional perspective, it's a light shade and a dark shade, but we're looking at things three-dimensionally. So it's popping up in our face physically, not on a two-dimensional surface. Two-dimensional surface now, you have to have two values. Right? The value is the wave that's behind the wave, the color behind the waves is light. The colors in the forefront of the wave is dark. And the light and the dark has to blend into a kind of symphony where it transitions from darkness to light or from dark to bright in a very smooth, uncorrelated or unrelated finish. You mustn't see how the dark shade becomes the light shade. It has to be fluent. It has to transition fluently, where it fades right in or it fades right out effortlessly. The way it looks like one, but it's really two. Now on a two-dimensional surface, when you have this wobbly line, this wave, and you have the up under the two-dimensional surface now, you have to shade the upper part of the line in a lighter shade. You have to shade the lower part of the line in a darker shade. And this is what will create that optical illusion on a two-dimensional surface. Right? And there's actually three values here. Values is a jargonic term. Every field have its verbosity, right? And values means number of shades. Two values mean two different shades, right? And if you look at the ocean, it's two shades. You have the light shade on the upper part of the line if you look at it on a two-dimensional surface. And then you have the dark aspect of the line, which is below. And then you have the fundamental color of the ocean itself. So the ocean has this fundamental default color we call the primary or the dominant. And the subordinated color is the dark shades that's reflected off the waves, and the light that's reflected off the wave. So you need that light and you need that darkness, right, on a two-dimensional canvas to give that three-dimensional optical illusion. And what I find fascinating with art is the way we see that optical illusion of a three-dimensional depiction on a two-dimensional surface, which actually is an optical illusion. We know that is a byproduct of shades, certain aspect of shades and certain aspect of darkness. So what you find in art is darkness tends to ground the object. If you're painting a ball or an oval shape, darkness tends to ground the object. It makes the object sit. It solidifies it. And light tends to make it pop. It depends on the angle, the light that is reflected on that particular object. But what I find about wave to be a fascinating phenomenon in art, not just wave. I have this infatuation, really have an infatuation for translucency, transparency, a translucent art. Things like you could see through, like glass, reflective plates, mirrors, or spoons. Spoons have multiple reflections, and I find that to be an intriguing phenomenon. You have to begin to draw things that reflect. You have to draw an eye drop. An eye drop is a transparent form, but technically the color of the transparency is really a byproduct of the object, right? The object that the object that the water is cascading from. If it's cascading from rocks, technically the water is transparent, but on a two-dimensional surface we have to use the color that the water is cascading from. If it's cascading down the rocks, it will be the color of the rocks. So you need a mild version of the color of the rock itself. You need to convert that into values, and then you need to change that color to match the water. Now has to have a light variation of the actual rock color itself to give that. To articulate this theoretically, you have to go into a lot of details. Like you have to understand how many shades of white to use, how many shades of dark, and a lot of this stuff I noticed primarily in you see the physiological I got into the physiological and the kinesiology of superhero superhero physiology, or superhero anatomy, or superhero physiology, anatomy, or kinesiology, the mechanics, the anatomy, how they pose, how they present themselves, how models pose, how heroes pose. And when you study the anatomy, you look at, let's say primarily a bodybuilder flexes back. When you look at the bodybuilder flexes back if you look at things two-dimensionally, not from a three-dimensional perspective, if you look at the bodybuilder flexing from a two-dimensional perspective, you'll notice that the aspect of his back that pokes out frontwards close to you tends to be brighter. And the crease, all the parts where his flesh kind of converge or squeeze together, you'll notice like there are dark lines. Like two-dimensional, on a two-dimensional canvas now, you have to have those dark lines. You have to have those light lines. And that is determined by the number of different values. So this is what's fascinating with art. In order for that three-dimensional object to pop on a two-dimensional surface, you have to really understand the level of opacity. It comes down to opacity. Opacity is the biggest determinant factor. Right? If you give a person muscles, you have to raise the value up just one tiny opacity. Sometimes it's just 2 to 5% opacity. Because sometimes those lines, or let's say that biceps you're drawing on a bodybuilder in art, right? If the opacity is not at the right percentages, the bodybuilder abs will look like a bunch of lines. You have to find the right level of opacity. And to create that abs, you have to know where to place the dark aspect of the light, and you have to know where to put the bright aspect of the light. It really comes down to understand how light and dark. That's why I find the grayscale. This grayscale in art is a fascinating phenomenon, because in the grayscale you're only dealing with really black and white values. You're going up the spectrum and down the spectrum, polar opposite contrast, black and white. In the grayscale, you get to experiment with a limited amount of values. And if you're studying art and you're studying the grayscale, and you're experimenting with primarily black and white colors, you could really develop your intuitive sense of knowing how to make things pop, how to give things that three-dimensional perspective. And I think when you really develop that, I think that's the foundation for realism. That's from my perspective. That's the foundation of realism, because when you begin to make a face pop, then the face begins to give that three-dimensional depiction. And from there you could go into the detailed aspect of creating the realism. Whether you want to pixelate that image whether you want to pixelate that image on a molecular level, you want to go down to a micro level or molecular level, and you want to pixelate the image. This is what they do in realism. It's a very fine, detailed, pixelated evolution of art. Very detailed. And this is why I love the juxtaposition of incongruity in art, because it merges incompatible. So realism deals with what Salvador Dali defines as a juxtaposition of the subconscious in the dream state. This is where all Salvador Dali art derived from, the juxtaposition of the subconscious and the dream state. And what you see in the juxtaposition of incongruity in art is, you see where these artists sort of polarize these contrasts, these two polar, unrelated objects, and they have a way of cohesively bringing these disparity together in a really artistic correspondence. Like you just see a symphony. It's absurd. It's usually an absurd. It's an absurd surrealism, actually. Like you merge an ice cream and a hammer, and you create an ice cream hammer where the hammer head is actually the snow cone. That's a prime example of surrealism, but absurd surrealism. Absurd surrealism is where when you juxtapose the polarity, or you juxtapose the incongruity, and you find a single common denominator they share, and you merge them into